Hello everyone, hope you guys are doing well. I just wanted to make sure everything is working, and I believe that it is. Thank you for joining us. So this is a beginner's guide to gouache. If you're here, hopefully that means you have an interest in gouache. You're willing and ready to start your adventure. Or maybe you even know a little bit about gouache. Maybe you even know a lot of it. In fact, I know some people here who are fantastic at gouache. But regardless of who you are and what you're doing, we're all here with the same goal, and that is essentially to talk about gouache. I'm very excited about that. To be transparent, I have a gouache course. It's starting on Sunday. I would love to see you guys there, but zero pressure. You don't have to come, but yeah, follow the link wherever it is to my website, and I'd love to see you guys there. It's an 8-week course where we're expounding on absolutely everything we're talking about here. Yeah, it's been really good in the past, but enough of that. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but mostly we're here just to talk about what's here and now. So if you are following along with paint today, which you don't have to, but if you are, then we have a couple of things. In the last link that was sent to you, we have this image, so feel free to go ahead and grab that image. If you have your paper ready, we're going to do something here before we start talking, which is we're going to wet our paper. So let's grab a brush and just wet the paper. We're going to do this on the front and the back. So yeah, a lot of you guys are going to be new to gouache, and that's really exciting. I'm really excited to get to share my passion for gouache with you. One of the things that gets really annoying when you start painting with gouache is that any amount of water on the surface of your paper is just going to completely throw you off, because we wet the top and then it starts to buckle. You can kind of see that already. It's starting to do its job. And buckling of paper comes from an uneven distribution of water. So our goal right now is to transfer that into an even distribution of water. And all that means for us is that, yes, we are painting the front with water, and then we will flip it over and paint the back. We've seen a lot of really good questions here already today. One of them was about surfaces, and yes, we are going to get into a lot of good things. So the structure for today is we're going to talk about gouache as a general, kind of looking into the fact that it has a very specific look that's often sort of portrayed out in media, but it can do so much more. And I'm really excited about that. I love how versatile gouache is. And yeah, we want to explore that because there's so much we can do with it. So much we can do with it. So we're going to do that. We're going to explore that. We're going to start talking about where it stands with something like maybe watercolor. How is it different? How is it the same? How can we use it? And then we're going to start doing like a little demonstration, and there's a lot to talk about in terms of how we're actually proceeding, what different kind of techniques we can use. One of the things about gouache is that it's really versatile. It is immensely versatile. So right here, right now, I've wet the front, I've wet the back, and I'll put it down. This kind of means that it's going to suction onto this, and it's really not going to buckle. We do have one question about what kind of paper I'm using right now, which I'm very happy to answer. It is Arch's Hot Press. We will be getting into papers later in more detail, but Arch's Hot Press. So someone said they don't like prepping paper for gouache. I don't normally prep paper for gouache. Well, you don't always have to, right? You don't always have to, but I'm trying to get into as much value as we can, learning things immediately. So yeah, let's actually get started into looking at some different things that gouache can do that we don't often get portrayed. All right. So first of all, I'm not going to go through every single one of these and tell you all about them. That would take us a lot of time, but it has been used very illustratively in the past, in the 60s, 70s, now 50s even. Used gouache a lot for illustration, and so it kind of has the ability to create these really big flat areas the golden age of illustration is full of gouache absolutely everywhere. And the really cool thing is that this is not its only application. We can go ahead and find something like this, which is, it really actually kind of looks like a watercolor. And so we can use gouache transparently as well as opaquely. And again, we're going to get into what that means and how that's important to us. But what it means is that it can look a lot like watercolor, and then it can look a lot more like this kind of classic gouache look that we often go for. This is another beautiful one where we can start to explore almost like an oil painting look. When we're using gouache so that everything's a little bit wet, then we really do have this kind of oil painting acrylic kind of look. And so I just wanted to mention while we're here, my assistant's right beside me and she's kind of writing down questions, and during kind of every segment where we're talking about materials, then we're going to start to actually get into the materials questions. We can talk about that. We can talk about technique. When we get there, we're going to start answering some of those questions. So that's really cool. So yeah, Shetty says that gouache has an impressive range, and I am 100% with you. Like, here is that again, that kind of very illustrative look. But then look at this. This thing looks like a classical painting. This is like, I mean, it is a classical painting, but it looks like oil, right? It's a very classical look, very 70s look. Here we go. Here we have, actually, very modern. This is by a guy called Gouache Studio on Instagram. Marvelous painter. But I kind of just wanted to show that we can really get almost into that anime background kind of feel. In fact, Studio Ghibli uses poster color. And poster color is, it's essentially gouache. Here is Jared Cullum. He's going to be coming in and helping out doing feedback in my gouache course. But really that kind of like bold, beautiful kind of look. And here's something I did during lunch the other day. Just a little portable thing, and some Sargent where we're mixing watercolor and gouache at the same time. Now there will be people who will try to convince you that's a terrible idea, but there really is there's no purist way of dealing with painting. Whatever gets us to the end result that we want is a fantastic way to paint. So yeah, like everyone's saying, amazing range. There's so much we can do with it, whether we want it to look like a real classic painting or get into the real graphic feeling of a lot of the things that we might be far more familiar with. So I don't know about you, but it excites me. It excites me to know that, like, you know, when I was growing up, I always thought that watercolor looked like watercolor and oil looked like oil. But in the end, I feel like every single paint that we have, every single medium has something to teach us. And for me, that's really exciting that it has something to teach us. So that's that huge dynamic range of gouache, and I'm really excited to share that with you. So I started getting into gouache because of its ability to go out and do plein air painting. I was using oils, and it just took forever. And to dry, to sort of like transport, I had to be really careful. I had kids and a cat, and no, like that stuff was getting all over the house. And oh my goodness, like it stopped me from painting. And so I picked up gouache, and I had a strange relationship with it first because it has some qualities such as the value shift. When it dries, some of the darks get a bit lighter, some of the lights get a bit darker. And at first I thought that was a problem and that I couldn't overcome it, but you can, right? And we're gonna talk about that. But just the ability to go out and paint these beautiful landscapes and then close up the book. I even have some things where I could work on some more figurative pieces. And you just saw the amazing dynamic range of gouache, which is really exciting. Oh, here's one I did, absolute utter chaos. I did this just the other day at like 6 a.m. in the morning, right before the kids woke up. But yeah, so gouache gives us this ability to travel, to paint. And the exciting thing is it's not limited. It has this immense dynamic range. So that is really cool. Another thing is that it's cheap, relatively cheap. It's easy to clean up. And even though that sounds like a thing that shouldn't be important, what's important to me and what I feel like is really important to you is that you actually paint, that you actually get to it, that you can sort of, especially when I had kids, I didn't have like 4 or 5 hours a day at a time to just sit down. Like I'd do something and then they'd run into the room, and I had to have the ability to close things up and put it away, open it up and paint for 2 minutes and then sort of come back to it. Yeah, so that's really cool. As well as, because it's so versatile, it actually means, like if you spend the time in gouache figuring out how to do this, then when you get to oils, it's easy. And if you spend the time figuring out how to do something a lot more watercolory like this, then when you actually get to watercolors, you have that skill. So there's a lot of skill stacking involved, which is really cool. And so the first thing that I want to sort of get us into is start to talk about transparency and opacity. And so the question is, what is transparency and what is opacity? Because these things are really the difference between watercolor and gouache. And so I actually have some watercolor here and I have some gouache, and we're going to get to see this difference. And the really cool thing is that watercolor doesn't necessarily have the ability to get really opaque. Gouache has the ability to get transparent. So I'm going to pick up some watercolor here, and we're going to have a little look at this. So this is our watercolor. And then I'm going to wash this off, pick up any color. And by the way, if you guys have questions, if we have any questions now for the kind of things we were just talking about, now might be a great, good. Now's a great time to start getting into it, because we're here for you guys.
Okay, well, first of all, Gogo Taku asked if the stream is going to be recorded for later.
Oh, good question. Is the stream going to be recorded for later? Yes. Yes, it is. You guys should be able to come back to the page you're on, and we're going to try and figure out how to possibly even get on YouTube a bit later. So I think we're going to be all good. If you have to bail out, go for it. We'll be here for you. Okay, so feel free to
keep going.
Yeah.
All right. Michelle asked, "Do you have to use synthetic brushes? Can you use natural hair?"
Okay, you absolutely you can use whatever you want. What I have found with brushes, and we may as well just get into the brush conversation here, is that a lot of brushes are designed for something like oil or acrylic. They have a lot of body to them, the oil and the acrylic, so you need a really stiff brush to be able to pick up the paint, to have the paint do what you want. So gouache brushes, there aren't really gouache brushes, but you can use those, and those are going to give you a very straight, very like there's going to give you lots of streaks in what you're doing. So normally I like to use synthetic brushes, or something like the really soft hairs, really soft natural hairs that the qualities I look for are, does it bounce back into place? Because if it does that, then I can predict where it's going to go and what it's going to do. But actually being soft means that you can get a lot of paint down, and that's really nice. So yeah, watercolor brushes, anything designed and marketed for watercolor is perfectly good with this. And then your sort of oil brushes are going to be a little more stiff.
Okay. Gluaka asked, "Can you apply gouache to any kind of material?"
You can. Paper seems to be the most versatile in what you can do. We're gonna get to this later, but you can do something on like one of these artist panels, and if you do it on an artist panel, you can put your gouache down, but because it doesn't sink into the paper, you have to wait a long time between your layers. This is something I did like 2 or 3 hours ago, and this stuff is still here, right? A lot of this water. And so if I put my brush down, it's going to pick up the paint, and get a little messy. So you can do it, and it's actually really quick. Because it doesn't sink in, your paint goes further. But yeah, you need to wait for it to dry completely and then do your other layers. So it's very quick, so long as you're able to sort of step away between layers. And you can do something on canvas. This is some canvas I have, so let's go ahead and put a little paint down. The hard thing about canvas is because the paint doesn't have body to it, which means that it's not thick. You can't like pick it up. It's not like toothpaste when you put it down. You're gonna get a lot of this stuff in here. The gesso might reject the paint, as well as it often is harder to have really clean edges. So it's not a problem, but it is a little bit more work trying to get some very sort of consistent areas in your paint. Normally paper is what we go for.
Someone did just ask, so you can do it in a notebook. So.
A notebook, absolutely. Yes and no. So I wouldn't pick up like a composition book that is for writing, because the paper is just not designed for that. Let's go through some of the books. So I suppose we're jumping around, and I think that's perfectly fine. So this is a moleskin, and obviously I've painted some gouache in here. When I did that, it kind of got a little bendy, a little warped, just because it's really not thick. Here we have a really old one. This is an Arteza watercolor book, and again, at the time of painting, you get some really big bends and folds, but it comes back. I normally suggest anything like 140 pounds plus has just enough body that you're not going to be sort of going through it, but you really can get away with a lot. Like, this is designed for sketching on. It's not thick paper, so you can get away with a lot. And this technique of putting water on the front and the back does stop things from buckling a lot. Dave says, yeah, gouache on wood paper. Kyogi is fun. I haven't tried that one. I have done gouache on wood, and that's also really fun because it doesn't dry as matte, and so you can sort of retain a little bit more of that, the value range, which is really cool.
Mar asks, do you have to always wet your paper first?
No, absolutely not. Do you have to wet your paper first? No. So really, that at the moment about managing buckling. So at the moment, it just won't buckle until a couple of hours. It's also about the fact that when I wet the paper first, front and back, and it doesn't buckle. Right now, it's dried a little bit. But what happens is that the paper now has a certain water quality to it. There is water in there, which means that when I paint, it's not going to dry as quickly, which is really cool because that lets me do things like creating this figurative work where there's rendering. Like, it feels like an oil painting because there's rendering, and I'm sort of working into things. It's because the paint is supplied with extra water and stays wet and workable for longer. A lot of people get really frustrated at first because they're trying to do something like that, but they're not actually doing the water work. And that means that you just get like really big strokes absolutely everywhere. And it feels like you're running in circles, which in a way you are. Any other questions?
Oh yeah. Okay. So, how do you prep really big paper? Do you still use a brush?
A really big paper? Okay. So with really big paper, I get something like this. And this is my canvas. This is just regular canvas. And instead of using that brush the whole time, I will absolutely soak canvas and put it underneath the paper. And then I put the paper into the sink, or I run water over it in the sink, and then I come and put it on top. And that means that this has more water in it, obviously, than just the paper. And then again, that sort of continues to feed it through. That's only really actually if I want to spend a lot of time on something figurative or something that I know is I'm gonna need that time. If I don't need the time, then I don't really need to do that. Yeah.
How do you use gouache in a sketchbook?
In a sketchbook, the same way you use gouache anywhere else. I don't mean that to sound demeaning or
I
anything.
think they probably
What's
mean
the
about
context
like
of the
if
question?
you've got like your wet paper in your sketchbook. You know, it's a little.
Oh, sure. I, I, let's see if I have one of my normal sketchbooks here. So, often, this is a good solution. You know, holding it like this, and I can sort of work like this. I generally have a towel or something, and so I can put my towel over my wrist, have this here, kind of have just about everything. Water's going to need to be separate so that I don't drop it or spill it or anything like that. But yeah, or even just flat on the table like this. So let's take a break for a minute. We do have this. Now that this is dried, I think it's a little more obvious, this difference between transparent and opaque. And the really cool thing with gouache is that I can go ahead again and grab this blue that I used just a second ago, and I use it with a lot of thick paint. And now I'm going to use it with thin paint. And we can come in and do something that looks and feels like our watercolor, but it's our gouache, right? And so with gouache, we have this full range of transparent to opaque. And so what that means for us is if we're doing transparently just in watercolor, every time I put down color, it gets darker and darker and darker and darker. And so that there's a really important need in watercolor to work from light to dark and try and reserve your lights. But now that I'm working also opaquely, I can come in with, say, this here. And I can come in and paint over the top. And now I don't have to worry so much about preserving those lights because it's opaque, because I cannot see through it. I can just do layer on layer on layer. So when it comes to layering, one thing that we want to do is really just wait for it to dry. A lot of people have trouble with layering. Most of that trouble comes from the fact that they did not wait for the paint to dry. Shetty says, thank you, mighty assistant who reads the chat and takes in all the questions. Yes, I agree. Thank you very much. So often, to get this full range, something like this, I painted with a lot of water at first, really transparently around the edges. And that does a couple of things for me mentally as well. One is it's kind of prepping the grounds of what I'm going to paint on it, getting a feel for things. And the other really important thing with working transparently and working with a lot of water is it means that I can actually have really soft edges, which is not something you normally see in your everyday gouache troubles and tribulations. You don't often see that, but working transparently and with a lot of water at first, here, let me fix that. That is our almost half-hour mark. Sorry, cameras do that. Yeah, we get a lot of ability to come in and play really softly. And then it dries and I can put all these sort of hard lines down. So where watercolor is concerned about preserving and working light to dark, gouache, as far as I'm consider, is more concerned about working with soft edges to hard edges. And that's even true on a very small scale. Even if you don't wet your paper and do anything like that, if you put one stroke down and another stroke down right beside it, even if the paper's dry, you're going to have interaction. And we have to count on that. We have to it's a really good thing. Like we can really lean into that. And I suggest that you do. It's going to make painting with gouache a lot more satisfying and fun. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about paper. Paper. Is there any questions we have about paper?
Let's see. Well, sort of, kind of. Ahamna Muhammad asks, will gesso make it easier to paint gouache on canvas?
Will gesso make it easy? Well, what we just saw when we were playing around with this was the gesso actually rejecting the pure water, right? Because it's if you're using a gesso, it forms a surface that's sealed. So this acrylic surface formed by the gesso actually kind of rejects the paint, which you can deal with. You can deal with by just putting down more layers. You can also deal with that by here. Here's some things that I painted earlier, and this is not gesso, but if this were gesso, I could come in on top. And what I've done is actually I've painted this in casein. And so casein is a milk-based paint, and obviously it's not the subject of what it is that we're talking about necessarily, but I can get something like an acrylic base, like a gesso. I can paint black and white on my colors in casein, and then it gives a porous surface that then I can, come in and start to glaze over the top. Now we did just have a question about glazing. Is glazing and layering the same thing? The answer is yes and no. Glazing is a subcategory of layering where we're really relying on the transparency. So as we saw before, when you use a lot of paint, you're gonna start with gouache. You're gonna start to sort of be playing back and forth and painting on top of what you already have and covering over. But right now we are glazing, and that means we can still see what's underneath. But with gouache, we have the ability also to paint thickly where you no longer see what's underneath. And so it's on the spectrum, and it's a big spectrum of what happens when we start to layer.
So I have kind of a trio of questions that I'd say go together.
Absolutely.
Alexandrina asks, is it okay to use watercolor paper or does it need to be smooth? Andrea asked, do you use rough or smooth paper? And Shake asks, what's the difference between hot and cold press?
Aha, they are. They're all the same question. So I personally have a preference for hot press. So hot press and cold press are essentially the two options, or two of the options you get when you are picking out a watercolor paper. And hot press is really smooth. It's really, really smooth. It's kind of just, when you think of like a paper that you're working on or writing on, it's smooth, right? And so hot press is like watercolor paper, but really smooth. Cold press is the very same thing, but it has a texture to it. There's no right or wrong as to whether you should use one or the other, but most artists that I know prefer to use watercolor on cold press because that gives it texture. It really lets it sort of do its own thing. And when they use gouache, they like to use hot press because it gives us the ability to have something like smoother gradients and harder edges, a little bit more control. And often people like to use gouache when they want control because we're all control freaks, us gouache folk. But no, that's not true. So yeah, that's the difference, and that's my preference, but it really is just a preference. There's no right or wrong concerning that.
David asked, can you paint on a stay wet palette indefinitely?
I'd
say on paper.
Like when you're doing something like a stay wet palette, the answer is yes and no, like the answer to most things. So you can. The only thing you want to be wary of is getting to a point where you're starting to grow your own mold farm, and so. But that's actually that's a good segue into another idea that you can use, which is that like every couple of days you really want to put that thing out in the sun and make sure that it dries, it gets dry. For those playing at home who don't know what a stay wet palette is, this is it. It's the one that I'm using. And if I can get this off. So it's like this little tub that has a sponge underneath. And the sponge is full of water. And then I have a semi-permeable layer on top, which is essentially paper that doesn't let the paint through. So this paint just stays on the top, it doesn't sink through, but it does let water through. So the water comes and it kind of soaks up. And what this means, it's so handy, is that It just means that our paint is there and it's staying exactly the same throughout the whole process. And so you can use this for your palette. You can also make one for your painting. And it means that it retains a lot of the same values. Because when you start to get into gouache, at least for me, the number one thing that's really frustrating until I learned to predict it was the fact that the colors, the dark colors dry lighter and the light colors dry a little bit darker. So everything sort of comes into more of a mid-range. The number one thing you have to overcome when you start to use gouache. Dave says, I got my first stay wet in this week, prep for the gouache course. Fantastic. They're very helpful.
Hattie asks, is sizing as important for gouache as it is for watercolor?
Yes. I'll tell you why after a sip of tea. So sizing, again, for those playing at home, sizing is what is inside the paper. It's like the glue to the paper. And what happens is this glue can actually, it can actually degrade. So you can have old paper that is too old. And what happens is that kind of instead of the paint staying enough on top of the paper that it retains its like intensity, like this really big, beautiful green. When you have an old paper, and you'll know when it happens, or you'll know that something funky is happening when it does happen. In fact, I kind of actually saw it a little bit on this, is that, yeah, what you're putting down sinks through, and it kind of sinks too far through. And so it's a little harder to get your hot edges. It's a little harder to retain some of the vibrancy of the color. But I will say, personal preference, Arches paper has the best sizing I am aware of. I love it. Love it, love it.
Let's see. Do you want some more questions?
I just want to make sure that we're getting where we need to go, and I think we are. So let's actually start to paint a little bit, and we can keep going with questions, and I will interrupt every now and then with things about our painting. All right. Okay. So feel free to throw a question at me.
Well, here's two different of the same. One is acrylic gouache and regular gouache. Like, how are they different? And one is, can you use matte acrylic like gouache except for reactivating?
Yeah, okay, so acrylic gouache and matte acrylic are kind of like gouache and acrylic, both meeting somewhere in the middle. And the real difference is that it doesn't reactivate. And so a lot of people, when they first start with gouache, again, it's a bit annoying to have to be careful about reactivating. But the good news is that we can actually use that to our benefit. Something like I can grab, with regular gouache, I can grab this painting. And again, talking about stay wet palettes or something, I can grab a towel and wet it, put this on it, put a book on top, and that water is going to sink through the paper. And then I can actually, like 10, 15 minutes later, start to work on this painting as if it's fresh and wet, which is amazing. Something people don't normally think about. And when you realize you can do that, that means that you can I can paint now. I can work on this painting like in a week or in 2 months, and I can keep going. But the acrylic gouache, that's not going to happen. Acrylic gouache and matte acrylic, once they dry, just like oils or casein, they're not going to lift. You can see how with the casein, I was able to put this paint down. With something like acrylic gouache or the matte acrylic, actually, I haven't tried the matte acrylic, but something like acrylic gouache, the surface isn't quite as porous as this, and so it sometimes rejects the paint a little bit. You're going to end up with beading. But yeah, okay, so that's kind of really what's going on there. Let's work on this just for a second, and we'll get it started. So if you are at home, if you're playing the game, what I want you to do is we're going to grab a blue. I'm going to use something like a cerulean blue, and this is something I really want to emphasize, because when it comes to beginning painting with gouache, the biggest problem we have, biggest problem that I often see, is people not using enough paint and not using enough water. So if you go away from this and you get nothing else, you have to use enough paint and enough water. So I've kind of got my cerulean blue right here. If you don't have a cerulean blue, anything in that family, you could even use something as warm as a cobalt blue if you want to. So I'm going to do this and a little bit of white. And what we're looking for is trying to get your paint opaque. It's harder than you think, but because this is the game that we play when it comes with gouache, and it's not a morality game. There's no right and wrong if you're dealing with transparent or opaque, but you want to know which one is happening. The best indicator we have for this is how is your brush. So right now, can I see the color of the bristles under my brush? If the answer is no, then chances are when I put this paint down, and I'm going to do it, and you can see there's trees and stuff here, we're dealing with gouache, so we can paint over it. So I'm just going to go and do this. Is it the perfect color? No. Is that okay? Yeah. So I'm going to add to this mix. I'm not attempting right now to make a perfect gradient because that's another conversation, and this particular conversation is targeted towards people who are kind of just starting their journey. But we want to do this right here. And just like we were talking about with our transparent versus opaque, if I can find that, which I don't think I can, that's okay. Yeah, our goal is that it's gonna become this really big flat area of color, and that's fantastic. So while I'm doing this, I'm actually going to put in this background here, this mountain again. I'm just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to put it all the way across the whole thing. We're going to come and paint on top a little bit later. Are there any questions while I do that?
Let's see. Daniel asks, no, let's see. Sorry. Michelle asks, is there a certain consistency to aim for?
Yes and no. Is that the answer to everything? So it depends. It depends on what our end goal is. Our end goal, whether we are transparent or opaque, what I like in here, I'll talk about the consistency I like inside my pans or on my thing if I'm taking it from a tube. I like somewhere in between toothpaste and cream, and the reason is I can take that just as it is and apply it, and it's really opaque, and I can trust that. I can also then add water to it and come across with something very transparent. And at all times while I'm painting, I'm going for something unique in terms of the consistency, because the end result that I want is something relatively unique. And so this is begins a conversation about painting with an end goal in mind, where there is no right and wrong, but we want to learn our medium, like gouache. We want to learn it in a way that facilitates our ability to say, you know what, I want this effect, and so I'm going to do it. And I want that effect, and so I'm going to change things and do it. And that's really the goal, that having that freedom is the goal of the gouache course. And so if you guys want to join, feel free to, but also, yeah. There we go. So I have these mountains in the back. Again, are they absolutely perfect? No, but they are facilitating the conversation. Any other questions?
Not any that are super relevant to this moment. So,
Okay.
Tagreed asked, do we always start from top down?
Oh, no. You can start wherever you want. We're not relying on gravity, so we're not necessarily having this kind of tilted up a little bit, anything like that. It doesn't really matter where we start. Often I start with the sky. I think that was habit, because quite often, like I said before, right now I'm not going into sort of gradients and smooth and everything. That's a more complicated conversation that we have in the course. Right now I'm just putting it in. So it's really just habit to do something like that. But if there's soft edges or gradients, I'll normally go for that first, because that sets the tone for everything else. I'm going to come in here, and this time around we're going to go for transparent. So while everything here is the same in terms of that first consistency, this time around I'm adding more water. So significantly more water. I'm trying to get a, like roughly this color that I'm going for. So we used the question before of, can we see the color of the bristles shining through our paint to determine whether we're going to be opaque? This time around with the same question, but we actually want to kind of be able to see that color. And here we can. So I'm going to come in here, and you can see already, because we can see some dark and some light, we're getting this transparent. And so we were just talking about sort of functional painting and having an end goal in mind. As I'm looking at this reference and I'm seeing changes in color, changes in everything that's going on, I want to replicate that. And I want to get that same degree of life and vibrancy inside of my painting. And so let's do something like that. Transparent paint has it's really vibrant. It's full of energy. And so I'm just going to put this in nice and simply. And we're going to do something else, which is we're going to grab like a little bit of brown and put that in. You can see that water there. And so working kind of some slightly different colors. And I do say slightly. We don't want it to be too much. Just some slightly different colors in. It's going to give us a lot of good energy in here. Vibrancy. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Shetty asked, does transparency add light more than a lighter value of a more opaque paint?
Does it add light? No, not necessarily. No, it is a little bit easier because it's transparent. Because you can see through it, we have the white of this paper kind of shining through. That does make getting a nice light color a little bit easier. But it doesn't. We can also get that very same value in opaque media. There is a little bit of a compromise when you start adding white, or we start dealing with this kind of opaque media. We do get a little less intensity in the color. So there's a slight compromise, but as it stands, these are already really intense, even if they're opaque. And so that compromise doesn't always actually come into play in practicality.
Michelle asks, is it possible to lift gouache similar to watercolors?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, let's make some clouds. All right, so I'm going to grab this. Oh, you know what? I'm just actually going to grab some paper. So this is... What's that?
Is that wet enough? I don't know.
I'm gonna wet my paper towel. We're gonna find out. I mean, I know that it is. The trick here is that this has actually gotten a little bit dry, and if I was doing this at the very beginning, then yeah, it would be a lot easier while it's still wet. But this is one of the benefits of having quality paper. So like, you don't need high quality paper, but if I was gonna try and lift inside this book, I would probably destroy the paper, or it starts like pilling up and starts falling apart. This Arches paper is beautiful, but I can come in and start to get some beautiful, nice clouds in here. And if I was doing this from the very beginning, I would lift up even more. All right, so we get some beautiful clouds coming in here. Yeah, these ones are nice and soft and subtle. And then I might come in and put a little bit of white in there, just to have a bit of fun. So one thing that I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna, to get these clouds to cover the whole thing, because I want more contrast. You know, instead of having actually like putting the gradient in paint, I'm kind of gonna imply the gradient through the clouds that we have here. So definitely try this at home. If you guys have, maybe try this as the last thing that you do, because if you do have a cheap paper, it might start to pull it apart a little bit. But yeah, notice that we've been painting this whole time, and the paper is completely flat. That's cool.
It's Arches.
It's Arches paper. Yeah, just to clarify. Thank you. Here we go. So I'm gonna grab this, get some white, some nice fluffy clouds in here.
I guess they want to know the full details of that paper, like hot press, cold press, etc.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So it's I'm just to communicate. I'm gonna put a lot of water in this, in this white, just to get it sort of nice and in. Yeah. So it is. It is Arch's hot press. I think it's. I don't know. What is it? 300 pound. I have it around. Okay. So I also want to. I'm going to share something here, which is right now, because everything's a little bit dry, I'm putting this down and it's coming across with a pretty hot edge. If I want to give it a bit of a softer edge, I can grab a brush, particularly a soft one, is this one's really soft, and kind of just play this edge around a little bit. Give me a slightly softer edge. Use your finger. Really, anything that will get you to where you want to be, go ahead and do it. Don't let any purists tell you otherwise. All right, so do we have any questions about... Well, I'll let you be in charge of questions. What do you think is next? What? Oh, anything.
Okay. Ash asked, does gouache allow for in details like colored pencils?
For what details?
Like in details, like colored pencils, like line art.
Oh, sure. You want to be a little bit careful about a pen or paper that's pencil that's underneath, because you have the ability to cover over it. But if you put that on top, if you put all that on top, then it will accept it entirely. It's very porous, and that kind of just means that it's almost going to act just like the paper itself.
Similarly, Mar asks, how do you make a pencil sketch without it getting blurry and gross when you start painting?
These days I don't use a pencil sketch. I kind of just go for it. But one tactic is to use something like a really light watercolor pencil, right?
A light blue.
And then it starts to... It kind of just comes into the paint, and it loosens up, and it will loosen up. I don't think there's a perfect way to do it.
A light blue one won't desaturate things.
Oh yeah, true.
Let's see. Alania asks, what brands of gouache do you recommend?
Oh, good question. Here, so I'll start talking about what I'm going to do next here, and then I'll get into that. So I'm going to come and bring in this road, and we're going to do that transparently again, kind of a nice gray, and then we're going to come in with something nice and dark. One of the things that's really effective is to sort of, you can see in this picture, we could come in with a lot of details. We're just going to focus on getting the silhouette. That's the outline of this. And then we can come back in. Gouache is all about the ability, you don't have to, but the ability to layer. And so we're going to do this really dark one, and then come back with some of the lighter over top, just to demonstrate that this is not watercolor. You don't have to do light to dark. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What brands of gouache do you recommend?
Brands of gouache. Okay, so I'm going to start this in reverse by saying that really my biggest suggestion and stipulation is that don't go to Michael's and Hobby Lobby and pick up their gouache. And we also had a question about hemi gouache in a different format, right? And I was actually able to use hemi gouache last week. I went and visited a friend, and what I would share about that is, we've talked so much about how a lot of this is about water. It's really about water and your ability to use water. The benefit of hemi gouache is that it... we said I was going to do this transparently, but I did not. It's okay. The benefit of hemi gouache, and for those who don't know what it is, it's like a jelly gouache, and so it never gets hard. You don't have to water it. By the way, water your paints 15-20 minutes before you start painting, because it takes time for that to sink in. I'm going to do a little demo about that here in a minute with some of the old paints that I have. We're just going to throw water in and start painting. It's not going to work very well. But so the hemi gouache it's tough. It's very useful for that scenario because it's just ready because it's wet. Um, uh, the problem that I've had with it, and also that I've heard other people have with it, is that you start to use it, and in its natural jelly form, it doesn't spread like this. It doesn't spread to be able to like just cover everything, and so you need to add water. But the minute you add water, you start getting more and more transparent really quickly, and so you're able to be ready to go and paint, and that's really good. And if that's your biggest problem, then use hemi gouache because I want you to paint more than not paint. That's the most important thing. But the compromise is that you do start to lose your ability to control how the paint comes out, and that's important to me. And if you want to have freedom in your ability to paint, which I want for you, then hemi gouache might be a challenge. And so I say that because some of the like Hobby Lobby and some of your like home brand gouaches, they end up falling into the same problem where where the ability to like control the opacity of your paint, it's compromised and it gets really hard. And so I say avoid those, and just about everything else is really workable. My own preferences are Winsor Newton. That's the one that I use the most. And then I also use poster color. We haven't really talked about that, but poster color is the cousin to gouache. It has slightly less body, and it has slightly more. It's slightly more opaque.
We've got all these people in the comments like, uh-oh, I use dried out old hemi and like Hobby Lobby gouache, and
Really, like
I use Hobby Lobby sometimes.
I'm ragging on it, but it's really
The real issue is the fillers, right? It doesn't dry quite as vibrant,
yeah.
especially in the darker colors.
Yeah.
Real chalky.
What I would say though is that yes, you are compromising, but if it makes you paint, then I want you to have that's real priority.
We've got a few different questions that are basically asking about the pan gouache versus fresh from the tube gouache.
Okay, yeah.
Like, how do you keep them wet? Do you dry them out, etc.?
Yeah, okay. Those are good questions. And by the way, I'm coming in, and this I'm working out really opaquely because it has paint to cover. So, we talk about layering. I want to make sure before I start that this is all dry. Otherwise, you start to get into picking up what's underneath. But if it's dry, then go for it. Okay. So, sorry, what was the question? I'm painting and talking. It's difficult.
Well, now we have another one too. The paints that you use in the pan, the dried ones.
Yeah.
First of all, like, which ones are they? What paint is that? It's Nika, right?
It's a mixture. It's a mixture between poster color and Winsor Newton.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's hard to tell a difference sometimes. I really what I use for poster color and the techniques I use for gouache are exactly the same. All you have to be aware of is at what point does it become transparent, and at what point are we using opaquely. If you're constantly aware of that, you're good to go. Let me go ahead and fix that up again. Okay, there we go. That's my half-hour timer. My camera just goes up. Woo!
Yeah, and then about, do you prefer like dried in the pans or fresh from the tube? And like, how do you keep your dried gouache ready to use?
Yeah. So I really, in practice, I use rehydrated paint 90% of the time. And so I'm not pulling from a tube, except for when I'm refilling. And that's because, yes, I've heard people talk about sort of things getting a little chalkier, a little more tough. But I actually think the problem that most people come up with when they're starting this adventure and they're starting to try and work their way from a pan is that they're not letting the water sink in enough. And in fact, let's just go ahead and do this now. Here's some old paint and we are going to like throw the water in, and we're going to start to try and use it immediately. We're not going to give it enough time to actually sink in, and I need to find some paper. Here we go. Yeah, so we're going to do that, and we're going to find our problem real quick. Okay, and so what I do, let's get some water in here. Oh my goodness, it's so dry. Here, look, this is what I do. This is a little thing that my assistant Rachel Danae got. It's really cool, but it's got a little lid, so that kind of lets me like do this and just get little drops through. And basically, what I do is I water my paint like a garden. Like I said before, like if I'm going out to paint, I'll do it before I leave and not when I get there. Okay. So this is what happens, right? People try to wet their pan, and then they go to paint, and there's just nothing there, and it doesn't work. And so you can wet it and try and like mix it up, and we're gonna get a bit better now. But it really takes 10, 15, 20 minutes to really sink in. And even then, I let it sink in, and then I use something like I did this just before we came on with this, and stir it, scrape it together, get it to like really get back into its position. Otherwise, you're fighting it. And I actually think a lot of people's problems when they come to using pans is they just don't they don't let that water sink in and mix and get to the consistency that's actually like really good and helpful for painting what they're trying to paint. And so, yeah, that's my practice when it comes to getting all of that stuff where it needs to be.
Dave says a Kikkoman soy sauce bottle is good for dripping water.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. Dave, always coming in with the great ideas.
And SD asks, what do you do with tube paint then?
What do I do with it? I put it in the pan. No, okay, so with tube paint, but for our real honest answer is, I normally put it out. Well, you try and get the water out first, because again, the amount of water and the amount of paint, the way these two things interact is the biggest key to your success as a gouache artist. And so, you know, I was saying before, I like it sort of somewhere between cream and toothpaste. Sometimes this I think this has come out pretty perfectly. And so straight out of here, sometimes you got to put a little extra water in, trying to get it to the consistency you want it. And you want it so that when you put it down, it doesn't come out transparent. That's really your biggest thing, because you want to have the option between transparent and opaque. That being said, we do need to talk about this. You can see this actually did come out pretty transparent. And that is that even though, so try and get this to zoom in a little bit, even though gouache is, you know, we call it transparent watercolor, opaque watercolor, they don't all have the same degree of opacity. See this little square here? This little square tells us that it is semi-transparent. You can see a little bit is white, a little bit is black. And then I have another one over here, this Arteza, which is 100% full, like it's white. And so that means this is really opaque. And then you'll also get gouache, probably some of your lemon yellows and stuff that is just like a full transparent open square that's not colored in. And that's gonna be relatively transparent. We always got to keep that in mind and be aware of that transparency. Like I said, being aware of your transparency, if you can do that, you're gold. All right, so let's try and get this in here. And feel free to share any other questions.
Let's see. Autofill asks, how do you keep your paper wet the same way as you've already demonstrated when you're outside plein air painting and it's like really hot?
It depends. Yeah. If the painting, and it depends if I'm here. Like I don't always have to wet it. If the painting I'm going for if it really calls for some very soft transitions, which I gotta be honest, this one probably doesn't, but I just kind of wanted to share this with you, um, except for maybe this gradient at the beginning. If it calls for some really soft transitions, then I will. And what I'll do is I will get my page. I'll wet the if I'm painting on this one, I'll wet the front. I will wet the back, and then I'll wet the next page, and then put it over. And so there's a lot of water, and it ends up being more important when it's really hot because the thing just evaporates immediately.
I bring a little mister bottle and keep my page wet.
Oh yeah, but it comes with some tricks, right? Like
You
because
don't want it on a smooth gradient.
no, because sometimes when you use the mister bottle, you'll end up with these sort of really big droplets, and they might wreak havoc on what you're doing. So that being said, and this is not something you can do outside. Sorry, I'm mindlessly doing this, but I have these. What do they call them? Evaporators.
No,
That's not-
humidifiers.
Humidifier. Oh, there's also another word for it. Vapor. No, I just call it a humidifier, and it mists. And so the mist that it pours out, it uses sound to actually create this mist, and then sort of just throws it up into the air. So I have one. If what I'm doing, if it's really dry and I can't get things wet and I need them wet, then I'll do that, and it'll just sort of mist. Diffuser. That's the one. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Yeah, you're the best. Yeah, so if we do that, then it really helps to keep things wet and it doesn't give droplets anywhere. It just a slight sense of a more humid environment. Otherwise, I might just pick a different subject that does not require such gradients, or use a technique that helps us to sort of communicate. That also, again, just does not sort of require all those gradients.
So a really fun question is how Lightfast is poster color compared to gouache.
It's actually, it depends. It depends on who you ask. If the company that you're getting it from, it will not tell you, don't get it from them. That's what I say. And then it also depends on the color. But that's actually also true for every gouache out there, right? That's also really true for that. And really you gotta look at them and be aware of what it is. And if you get a set and something like opera pink or opera red is gonna be terrible. It's just gonna it's not gonna be pink or red in 5 years time. Throw it out. Don't use it. With the exception if you're not planning on doing anything with your painting, it's just 100% practice, then use it. Because it's going to operate and work the same way. So as we're here, so this is something that we're going to work through in the gouache course, which we don't really have time for right now, but we're gonna throw it in here in the last minute, which is we've kind of got this right here, and if we can use gouache wet and wet, which means we get this like really watercolory effect, but everything's opaque, and so I'm going to mix two colors together. One is going to represent the light up here. One's going to represent the dark down here. And we're going to try and get them to work together really wet. And then after we do that, we're going to come in and put sort of the edges on, because those aren't going to really exist properly. What time is it?
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock. So we have half an hour? Did we start at 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we have time for this. Very good. So here's what we're going to do. We talk about having enough water, having enough paint. So I'm going to grab my green here. And what I'm going to do also, and this is something a lot of people struggle with, is especially when you first begin, the black and white quality of what you do, we call that value. And that's kind of, let's do this here. Like where does this tree fit? Like it's somewhere about there, right? So it's this dark. The black and white quality of what it is that we're using ends up being really, really important to us. And this gets difficult when we deal with gouache because if I paint something really dark, it's going to lighten up. And so it becomes important to have 2 or 3 nice, really dark pieces in here. So I've got a pure black, and then this kind of cobalt blue and some kind of brown. So my suggestion is really push it dark. This green that we're working with, which means using a nice dark blue, a nice dark green.
We've had some questions about what colors you're using right now, and do you recommend a specific type of color palette? Someone had asked if you like the classic palette of cool and warm for each.
I have previously very much used the cool and warm for each. It's very, very useful. But I also think if you can get your CMYK in there, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, that technically gives you the broadest palette you can get. And so having a magenta is really beautiful. Okay, so what I'm gonna do in here, I will sort of get back to that in a minute, but we're time rushed because this is all about the water. Using enough water and enough paint to kind of throw this in here. You can see it starts to like swirl around, and we want to encourage that. And it might take a couple of goes to get a really good feel. I'm actually going to use a lighter green up here so that it's more obvious for you guys.
You want me to answer people's questions in the comments?
Oh, sure.
I'm gonna let them know that I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Danae's my assistant. She's worked through the gouache course about 1 million times. She has done some professional work with me. She is amazing. Very much knows what she's doing. So if Danae answers your question here, that I have not been able to answer or have sort of missed out on, I 100% believe she knows exactly what she's talking about. Also, feel free to throw them at me as well. Here we go. Okay, so in this, you can see everything's wet, and we're gonna play around with this. It's really beautiful. And so what we're really dealing with here is fluid dynamics, right? What we need to make sure is that there's enough pressure. This is all about pressure. We're creating sort of high pressure areas and low pressure areas. And when you have this and you put a high pressure area, that paint's going to like spread out and explode. And it's going to give these like beautiful fractals, which is really fantastic. You can use this when you're dealing with clouds and with trees. We can do it sort of down here. Again, like you can imagine we're dealing with grass and do it like this. These are more advanced techniques, but they're really fun to throw in there, and they're a really good way to get the paint to do the work for you. Lisa says, do you often start with the Cristal, or is that just practice values? Normally I won't, and so what she's talking about is kind of these here, the value studies, the under paintings. I did these because I wanted to run through a bunch of ideas really quickly, and so I don't have to worry about color, right? And so I can just do black and white, throw things down, work into them, get everything exactly where I want to, and it works out the idea without having to stop and delay for trying to figure out what the color is doing. And even though the color is going to add the fun to it, working through ideas, this is a really good way of doing. And if something like this, I actually think I have a bigger version. Here it is. Something like this, what we're seeing right now is gouache. Doesn't feel like it, right? Like it's really subtle. And gouache doesn't always come across as being subtle. And so this is where working, I had that casein underlayer, and then I came in on top with some color. There's not a great deal of color variation, but we go from sort of a teal, more of a teal up here, and you can see anywhere that's facing upwards gets more like this moonlight, the teal, and then more of like a cobalt blue as we come forward. And so it's a really subtle shift, but it's what I wanted, it's what I was going for. But anywhere that my paintings rely on subtlety, I'll go ahead and do the values first, because then that's all I have to worry about. And so gouache is actually really fantastic It's we joke about it being the poor man's digital
Yeah.
because you can layer. The most important part about that is that you can really think about one thing at a time, and we can only ever think about one thing at a time anyway. But because gouache, you can do layers, and you can sort of work. I can do it like this, and then I can do another pass where I add another thing in and do another pass, all in a very quick time frame. It's like literally having digital layers, and you can sort of work your way through. Except that I can't go back to another layer. I can just kind of add on top, which is really helpful. Let's see, what other questions do we have?
Let's see.
While you're looking for questions, I'm going to come in here. So we have, let's zoom out a bit. We have a lot of detail in here, right? I'm actually kind of I'm gonna leave this as it was. Like it wasn't exactly a one-for-one copy, but we're just playing around here. I'm gonna do two things. One, I'm gonna come in and do some transparent washes. So something like adding a little bit of brown, and making sure that it's got enough water that it comes out transparently. One of the really good things about using a white palette is, again, I can actually see, like this paint here, it's opaque, and I know it's opaque because I can't see through it. And this paint here, it's opaque. I know it's opaque because I can see the white underneath. So it's another really good indicator of being able to predict what's going to come out the other side. And so I can use this and get some details in here, right? Again, talking about layers and being able to sort of jump between things and think about one thing at a time, I just threw that down. And now I can come in and put the details in.
Hamnamahad asks, what colors do you use for value study? Because I tried once with just black and white, but some grays were cooler and other grays were warmer.
Yeah, absolutely. I know what you're talking about. Oh. And that really comes down to the kind of black you're using. So some blacks are going to the colors shift as they change values and you add white to them. They shift, and they don't always shift in a forward direction. You would think that, like, if I'm using a black, then everything's going to be neutral gray on the way in. But different blacks, you'll start to add the white, and then they're going to like lean off to the side where they're going to be a little bit warmer. So they start to look and feel like, like browns, or they come out and they start to lean towards the blue. And so I don't know what black I often use. When I do this, in fact, you can see this right here. I'm really glad you brought that up. That's really interesting. You can see it right here. I don't know if the camera's going to pick it up, but down into our darks, it starts to feel a lot like there's some browns in there, and that's because that's kind of what happens when we use it transparently. Different paints have. I forget exactly the term for it, but they have a body color and then a base color. And so if you use it transparently, you're going to get something slightly different or slightly more rich or slightly more cool. And when you have a body, which just means a lot of paint to it, then it's going to be almost the opposite of that. And so it's one of those things about just being aware of it. I think I often use...
People might want you to paint a little more.
Yeah, let's go ahead and paint more. I think in poster color I use something called soft black. When it comes to some more traditional paints, I use something called ivory black. But it is a really interesting thing that happens. I don't think it's a problem, especially when it's just a value study. All right, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and use a color more opaquely, right? We're playing this game. We want to figure out how to be opaque, how to be transparent, and so playing in between them and really being intentional about it is one of your fastest ways to growth when it comes to painting with gouache. Actually, painting with anything, but for me, it's really a nice thing with gouache. What other questions do we have?
Well, okay. Someone had just asked the same thing about using black.
Oh yeah.
Do you ever go with straight black? Do you need it to be a touch of color? It's about getting your values dark enough.
Yeah. It's difficult. It really is difficult. I watched. This might not be relevant if you don't actually like sort of anime backgrounds, but gouache or poster color is a huge part of anime backgrounds, and so I love to watch them and sort of take note. And one thing that I took note, I showed my kids Totoro for the first time a couple of days ago, and they were obsessed. And it struck me how much black they used. It really did. And so there's this idea in Western classic art circles that are like, never use black, never use black. And there's a reason they say that. And the reason they say that is that generally we like to really try to keep a certain color identity. So when you look at something, you want to know that it has a particular, it's supposed to be representing a particular color to it. And when you think about that in terms of it's a whole dimension of information that's being given to you. And if you use black, you're almost not giving that dimension of information. And so there's a reason they do that. But also at the same time, color is relative. And so if I have a really warm palette and I use black, it's going to feel like blue. If I have use a really cool palette and I use black, it's going to feel like brown. And so I think that there's a trouble with being dogmatic about the idea of not using black. And quite oftentimes value, which again is your black and white structure, where everything in this painting is assigned a particular value. I think the sky is kind of up there, and this down here is kind of in between these. That's really, really important. And I think if you need a black, use a black. And especially when we're dealing with gouache, it's really easy to not have these extremes. And if it becomes important, then
I want to describe how the silhouette of that grass is giving it a lot of depth.
Oh yeah. Okay. So one really important thing while we're painting, thank you, is silhouette. Silhouette is a piece of information that our brain uses to tell us what it is that we're looking at. It also gives us a sense of okay. And so first of all, just with that, we see the mountain, and we have no information inside the mountain, but we know it's a mountain. So that's really important. That's something to dwell on, right? If you haven't thought about that before, think about that. We can see the silhouette of this tree, and without anything else, I know what kind of tree it is, right? If I know trees. And I didn't paint anything in the middle. That's really important for us as artists. And the second thing is that when we come to something like this, you can see this right here. There's no information about the way these two things interact. And so if I didn't have context, and our primitive brain does not take in context, it just has this raw information. If I start to put something like this, then our primitive brain says, oh, okay, that's grass, and it's going in front of the tree. And so something as small as describing what is essentially the silhouette of this grass, and I don't have to do it in great detail, and I don't want to do it in great detail, but if I do it, it adds depth. It tells my brain.
Well, and the difference between the tiny little back there.
And the big ones over here, absolutely. And so we anytime you can sort of communicate depth and communicate the silhouette, and that's why this was important here too, then it adds to our painting, and it lets us to scale back on everything else.
We have a couple of questions about detailing, like
let's go ahead.
How to know how much, when to, and like how close to the foreground do you add details? Someone says, I heard you're not supposed to focus on leaves. But I was always wondering, what do you think about when designing plants?
Yeah, okay. So again, you said that you're not supposed to focus on leaves, and I would suggest that is good advice, but do not be dogmatic about it. Don't let that rule over what you're trying to do. The biggest factor we have is that I'm painting a painting and I want someone to feel something when they see it. And so that's really important. What's the mood? What's the atmosphere? Right now, to increase the atmosphere, I don't need to add anything to the mountain, so I'm not going to. Back here, I don't need to add anything. And so that's kind of about atmosphere, and that comes in as value and color and everything. Detail is a factor of that. If I add detail to everything, then I'll lose my atmosphere. I lose the sense that this thing is closer to me so my eyes can see it, and that thing's further away so I see less. So that's number one. The second thing, and this one's really, really important, and it's a painting concept, not a gouache concept, and that is that, again, I'm painting, I'm trying to communicate something, and as an artist, I get to control how somebody sees my painting and how they see through it. And it's kind of like if I'm in a field and I'm choosing words to describe the field, I'm not going to just, there's a leaf, 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 there's a... I've lost my audience immediately, right? I'm going to say what's really important to me. I got to the field and it felt stunning and the tree was massive. Okay, so now we're talking visually, and probably in this tree and this tree are most important, just because I'm here and they're the things I want to focus on. So normally I try to find anywhere between 1 and 3 things, but let's go with 3, right? And 3 things that I really want people to see, and high contrast is going to give us a high amount of attention. That's the way things work. I actually have like a little demonstration here, just in case we got to this conversation, right? If I show you this, where does your eye go? It goes here. And it's not just because it's unique and different, because down here, I have those same little circles absolutely everywhere, but they're low contrast, and so my eyes don't go to them. They're like hidden details. They're beautiful things that I can look at later, but my eye goes here first. And then it goes to these guys, and then it goes in here. And it's because this is high contrast and it's big, and so it kind of moves between these big high contrast things. So I can add detail with low contrast and be communicating a lot, but not stealing your attention. And so we start to think about flow. How does somebody see my painting? This has the highest contrast, and so that's where my eyes are going to go first. I could also give high contrast down here. And so it's like sort of between these 2 things, and I want to add a third, right? And maybe in here, I can maybe in here we start to add in some stuff that's down here before us. I'm just kind of throwing things together, but suddenly my eye starts to come down here. And I don't want to do that everywhere. Otherwise, I'm telling you that nothing in my painting is important, because everything in my painting is important. What I want to do instead is kind of subtly work you through. I want to say, like, here's the most amount of attention, so I'm going to give it highest contrast. I'm also going to give it probably the most amount of detail, and then I can lighten this up a bit so that you come here second and not first. So we start to create a sequence.
Pin Scratch Studio Animation is saying that nothing bothers him like blobby foliage because they are a botany nerd, and so maybe you can talk about how you use the springy brush for the brush shape, for the leaf shapes.
Okay, yeah, sure. And so we were talking earlier about brushes, right? And having one of the biggest qualities that I look for in a brush is the fact that it kind of springs back to where it was. Now this one, here we go. That happens. That means that we're getting close to the end, right?
Yeah.
So this one's going to give us a very indistinct shape. It springs, and that's nice, but it doesn't end it ends like this, kind of frayed. It's just more textural based. But a brush like this, it's a round brush. It's really springy, means that I can use pressure to sort of work through the shape of what I have going here. We're also actually like pretty far out, so I'm going to do it down here just because that's like this far away. I'm not going to get that detail. And that far away, I'm not going to get that detail. But maybe, I don't know exactly what these are, but we can kind of like work our way through And so when it comes to that kind of thing, there's also, we don't want to detail too much, right? And so you're talking about like, we kind of want it to be accurate and right and communicate that this tree is this tree. And so that's where the silhouette comes in. So if I focus on really getting this silhouette to communicate the kind of tree I'm going for, and I have changed the tree from the reference, so my bad. But if I can get the silhouette to communicate the shape of the leaves and the shape of the tree, then inside I have leniency. Like I can be a little less careful about it, because our brains are they're pattern kings. They see a pattern and they apply it to everything else, right? And so long as we're not breaking that pattern inside the tree, then having the silhouette is our like first order of defense. It really helps us to communicate what it is that we're trying to communicate. And then inside we can start to sort of get a little bit of that. But again, if we put details everywhere, then our brain doesn't want to look anywhere. That's kind of how this works. Yeah. So let's have a look. What time is it?
It is 4:26.
4:26.
We are.
Well, I don't think we're gonna get it done necessarily. But I do want to share, if you guys enjoyed starting to learn about gouache and you want to learn more, then come and join us for the gouache course. It's an 8-week course where we go through your relationship with gouache. We get to the point where you can be confident that you can get the paint come out the way you want it to come out. That's important, because that gives you freedom. Yeah, so that's exciting. Let's see, is there any other last questions before we head on out? Let's see. Shetty says, I learned a lot. Hope I'll be able to go through the whole class soon. Yeah, it's worth staying up the night. Oh my goodness, I hope you guys brought coffee and it was worth it. All right, yeah, everyone's got to go, so I'm gonna, let's see, I took both the Intro to Gouache and Landscape course with Justin. Both are great. Watching today's refresher. Fantastic. Thanks, Amy. Have I written a book? No, we started, but writing is hard. But yeah, we're gonna grab the information from the course and other information about gouache, because I love it, and we will write a book eventually. We got to find a publisher. Really, that's kind of the biggest thing at the moment. Yeah. So like Danae said, there's a 3-month payment plan and 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you don't like the course, if it's not actually what you thought it was going to be, if it's not right for you, you can just send us an email and no questions asked, we'll refund you. But thank you guys. I really appreciate it. You're the best, and we'll see you later. I hope you tag me in any of the gouache things that you do because of this, or that you, if this has given you the courage to start working with gouache, tag me. I'll share it. I'm really happy to see anywhere that we've been able to sort of spread the news of gouache. Thanks.